Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 52, brought to you by the melted gelatinous puddle that used to be known as Drac. Yes, it's incredibly hot here, and for those of you who don't know, most buildings in the UK are not designed with aircon. They are in fact designed to retain as much heat as possible because we're usually a miserable, dull and grey country full of cold and wandering scousers. But at the moment, well, apart from anything else, it was record temperatures the last few days, and yeah, it's mind-numbingly hot. So if I do sound a little bit exhausted or you hear odd noises in the background, that's going to be a combination of lack of sleep from the fact it's far too warm to sleep, and the odd noises will be me trying to get a small air conditioning unit working so that my computer doesn't turn this entire room into a sauna. So, with all that said and done, there's not a tremendous amount of channel admin to be done this week. The t-shirt and other accoutrement shop has opened and seems to be doing relatively well. And yes, for those of you who have asked, the gigantic superstructure of Doom and the crushing hand of God, depth charge by Jellicoe, both of those are in the process of being developed as artwork designs, and hopefully we'll have those soon enough. So let's get on with the questions, shall we? So this week's questions from selected videos are taken from the video on HMS Sheffield and World's Warships Review Part the Second. So the main sources used for the video on HMS Sheffield were Norman Friedman's rather excellent book on British cruisers, plus Cruisers in International Encyclopedia, and Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships, as shown above. And as per last week, specific sources for specific ships in the World's Warships video, let me know in the comments below. Augusto Solari, was it Augusto Solari, asks, regardless of the controversy surrounding its sinking, which, despite being Argentinian, he believes was legit, do you think the ARA Belgrano posed a serious threat to the British task force stationed in the Falklands? Yes, the Belgrano did pose a serious threat. Its little battle group between it carried a number of surface-to-surface versions of the Exocet missiles that were already causing the British significant problems when launched in smaller numbers, and of course it was an armoured, not an armoured cruiser, but it was an armoured cruiser, as opposed to the more modern ships that the Royal Navy was using, which weren't armoured, that possessed a frighteningly large number of 6-inch guns, obviously with relatively decent modern fire control systems. So if it had managed to get close enough to the British formation in order to use either of the missiles present within its battle group and or its guns, it could have done an awful lot of damage. Whether it would have got there is another matter that's entirely up for discussion, because obviously if it had continued and Conqueror hadn't been able to sink it, then I'm sure the British would have thrown airstrikes at it, and there were plans by the Royal Navy to meet it in a surface gun battle with its more capable surface, the ships that it had that were more capable of surface action. Quite how that would have worked out, who knows? Probably better off that we don't find out. So it may well have been stopped before it got there at varying levels of cost, but that doesn't diminish the fact that it was a serious threat, which ultimately is why it was sunk. Fickle Finger of Fate asks, why was Scapa Flow selected as a home base for the British fleet? So Scapa Flow was chosen as the main British naval base in the basically as World War I started, for a couple of reasons. One of which was it is a very good natural harbour. I mean, yes, when they chose it somewhat at short notice, it was unfortified, and they needed to spend a fair bit of time fortifying it against submarine incursion and the like. But Scapa Flow is one of those great natural harbours, albeit it is a little bit in the middle of nowhere. And the other harbours were either a bit too far away or a bit too enclosed. The main reason they were looking for a new harbour base in the first place was that up until very close to the beginning of the First World War, the Royal Navy's policy in terms of a continental war was pretty much, with the serial numbers filed off, the same policy that they'd used in the Napoleonic Wars. which was show up off the enemy coast with a ton of ships and blockade them into submission, occasionally shooting anything that dared to come out. However, the very rapid advance of mines and submarines, as well as the increased strength of the high seas fleet, meant that when you combined all those together, the policy of close blockade suddenly became not really very tenable. I mean, if you look at what happened to Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy, that's pretty much what would have happened to a lot of ships if they tried to go with a close blockade. Fortunately, they realised this before the war broke out. Unfortunately, they realised it very, very soon before the war broke out. So that's really bad phrasing. Shortly before the war broke out, I should say. At which point they needed a new base, and they needed one quickly. And in the end, they actually made the decision that, well, since we're sort of hanging around and blockading the top end of the North Sea more than anything else, Scapa Flow is nearby. It's got advantages over all the other harbours we might want to use that are in the area, and so they went and used it. Of course, once you got to the Second World War, it also had the added advantage of being out of range of most of the Luftwaffe, which was incredibly helpful compared to places like Plymouth or Portsmouth, where the Royal Navy might have been based in the early 1900s. Andrew Kabush says, I probably speak for a few people when I say that the attack on the French fleet by the British is a special we would all enjoy. Well, as I think I've said before, I'm planning it. I've gone to the National Archives and got my hands on some of the original Admiralty report documents, both leading up to, during and after the attacks. So I'm poring over those, which gives some rather interesting insights into what was said and not said back and forth between the British and French command staffs. But yeah, I think I'm going to save that one for a period where my blood pressure is unusually low, because if I start going on about that, especially given what I've now read in extra detail, yeah, angry Drac might emerge, and I'd rather keep my blood pressure below double its normal. I have some very, very choice things to say about certain people that were involved in that whole little scenario. Airplane Master 1 says, a common detail for the town-class cruisers was the middle barrel of the triple turrets looking shorter than the flanking gun barrels. What was the purpose behind this? So yes, on the town class you can see, as per here, a nice picture of HMS Belfast, that the centre gun is slightly shorter in appearance than the others. It's not actually a shorter gun, it's just stepped back slightly. There are two reasons for this. One is slightly more mundane and is the lesser reason, and that is that by stepping the gun back, it means you're also stepping the gun crews back, which means that they can overlap each other a little bit because they're not all in a line, which gives each individual gun crew a little bit more room to operate, making it easier to load, which is always handy. The bigger issue is to avoid an issue that cropped up quite a number of times in triple turret design, and actually caused some issues for quite a while in a number of the American Standard class battleships, and that is interference between the shells. So if all your guns are nice and level and you fire them all off, if the gun barrels are too close together, the blast and shockwave from the guns firing and the shells in flight can actually interfere with the shells that are next to it, because they've all been fired at the same time in a single salvo. This in turn can deflect the shells slightly from their course, and at long range in terms of naval artillery results in quite horrific accuracy, because they go off in all sorts of wonderful directions. In the American ships, the sort of early to mid-standard classes, they would eventually solve this via a number of methods, but that included what they call delay coils, which would fire the centre gun at a slightly different time to the others. Not enough to change the fact that it is still a full salvo, but enough to, again, displace the shells relative to each other in such a manner that they didn't interfere. This is a slightly less technological but possibly more practical solution, which is simply by having the gun barrels at slightly unequal positions, it takes that interference pattern away. so you can fire all of the guns together all at once in a single salvo, but the shockwaves and blast waves of the guns firing don't interfere with each other in quite the same way as they would if all the guns were level, and that allows you to pack your guns in a little bit closer together. Bredley asks if the Royal Navy ships in Norway had all sailed back in a convoy rather than detaching glorious ahead, and they'd still run into the Germans, i.e. the Scharnhorsts, could they have won that battle? So if the carriers had sailed together, that's Glorious and Ark Royal, then they have a minimum 5 destroyer escort. Now if they run into Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, well, for one thing, it's not going to go the same as historically, because Ark Royal is probably going to have some kind of air patrol up, which means they will spot the German ships, in theory, quite a bit further out than HMS Glorious is. Oh, Germans? Really? You're here? In a war? Who would have thought? Boom. Which is basically the summary of Glorious's operational career when it came to that battle. Anyway, yeah, so spot the Germans earlier. To be perfectly honest, given that it's 2 battleships versus a pair of carriers and 5 destroyers, the British would probably just pile on this pressure on the boilers and just motor on out of there, avoiding counter entirely. If for some reason they decided to fight or forced to fight, well, 5 destroyers is a lot more of a threat than 2, and given that the 2, Acasta and Ardent, managed to land a torpedo hit on Scharnhorst, I think 5 is probably going to put up a relatively decent defence, even if some of them are going to be lost. And on top of that, obviously, with warning and with aircraft ready on deck, Ark Royal can start sorting out skewers for what they're worth, and more importantly, swordfish. And bear in mind, this is 1940, so this isn't Channel Dash with more and upgraded anti-aircraft batteries plus lots of escorts. This is just Scharnhorst and Gneisenau with pretty much their original anti-aircraft suite against incoming swordfish. And yeah, so that probably put a few more torpedoes into them. Depending on how the sequence of attacks goes, will probably determine the level of success. If the destroyers go in first, then faced with 5 destroyers launching torpedoes, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau probably just withdraw. If the air attack goes in first and is able to score some hits to slow them down, make them less capable of manoeuvring and distract them from the fact that destroyers are coming in, then the destroyers managing to get off more and heavier weight torpedoes might actually hand the British a victory, as opposed to just making the Germans go away or buying enough time for the carriers to get out of there. So it could go either way. It's very unlikely that British would lose carriers this time, but whether or not they win, let's say, up in the air a bit. B-Drill-Bot 121 asks, what refit or modernisation would you give a Lexington class battlecruiser? Okay, so refits for the Lexington class, well, I think this is going to be a 2-stage thing. First thing, as per Renown and Repulse, get this thing back into dockyard and give it some proper armour stat. Given the scenario, kind of like how Renown and Repulse were able to use quite a bit of leftover armour from other ships, you could potentially bring in some of the armour plate designed for the South Dakota 1920s, and if the main armour plate is too thick, then perhaps from some of the decommissioned battleships, but you need to get a lot more armour on this thing to make it, at least in some way, proof against enemy shot at some range, rather than just being an XP pinata for anything that comes along with a gun bigger than 6 inches. Then, in terms of the refit modernisation, I don't know, maybe late 1930s, or maybe Lexington, if it's still a battlecruiser, I'm guessing maybe bears at Pearl Harbor and gets hit and sunk. Well, look at what they did to the Colorados as an example. Obviously, you want to fit radar. It's got a fair bit of speed to it. You can probably afford to lose a little bit. In actual fact, the Lexingtons are probably in a very good position, because with their ridiculously insane top speed for a battlecruiser, you can afford to refit all their machinery with modern machinery and downsize the machinery spaces and thus the displacement quite a lot. because you don't even have to match it like for like. As you put enough power in for, say, 32, 33 knots, you've still got something perfectly capable of escorting a carrier, but needs dramatically less power, which obviously means dramatically less engines, quite aside from the issues with obviously replacing old machinery with new. That, and obviously strip out the secondary casement guns, 5-inch 38 caliber twins everywhere, and being a battle cruiser, it'll be quite long, so it can fit quite a number of them, maybe 5 or 6 turrets per side. Obviously keep the main guns, probably get rid of the cage masts, put some nice tripods in there, and combined with hopefully some decent level of armour, you've then got a ship that's capable of taking on anything in the Imperial Japanese battle line, except for the Yamatos, because it can, well, it matches firepower with everything up to and including a Nagato. It's faster than anything the Japanese have in capital ship terms, and it, in theory, would either be as well protected or better than a Nagato, at which point you have a very useful fast battleship, albeit one with potentially a little bit of lightweight protection compared to a true battleship. But then again, the North Carolina, South Dakotas, and Iowa's got away with 12 inches of armour, so why not the Lexingtons getting away with 11 or 12? That's how I'd do it, anyway. Armchair Warlord asks a two-part question. Firstly, would it have been more useful to continue to produce more Essex-class carriers instead of building the Midways, as I understand the Midways had stability problems? And secondly, was British ship armour actually qualitatively superior to American armour in World War II? I have seen conflicting claims. So, with regards to the Essex instead of the Midways, yes, the Midways did have some stability issues. I have heard some Americans refer to the Midways as roll your boat gently down the stream. But, that said, I think they were still definitely worth building. Basically, if you look at the Essexes, although they were very good for World War II, the rapid advance of technology did leave them behind. The fact that they were so good let them serve on in various roles, as covered in a couple of videos on the Essex class, but they were secondary roles. They were not fleet carriers in the space of, what, maybe 15, 20 years at all. So, yeah, I mean, they couldn't even operate the F4. So, but we can compare them to the Midways. The Midways could operate the F4, and admittedly they couldn't operate the F14. I'm sure Tom Cruise was very disappointed about that. However, they were able to later operate the F-18, so the Midways therefore had a much longer service lifespan, and obviously being larger could carry more aircraft, and so they gave far more useful service because, well, you had a supercarrier flight deck that could use as everything in the USN inventory apart from the F-14, which meant that you could use them as part of your battle force basically throughout the Cold War, with the exception of one of them, which was obviously broken up a bit earlier. And yeah, whereas you compare that to the Essex class, a handful more Essexes, given the sheer numbers that they had, are going to be far, far less use to the US Navy when they can't operate its premier fighter and occasional interdiction and ground attack aircraft, as compared to the Midways, which actually can, and can also, as I said, can also operate more of them. Now, as for whose armour was better, well, boy, isn't that a little can of worms to open up? But anyway, it depends on what kind of armour you're talking about, because you have broadly two types of armour in World War II. You have face-hardened and you have homogeneous steel. So face-hardened steel is the big heavy stuff you put to protect your capital ships, especially obviously your battleships, most especially and most obviously the belt armour. So in terms of the face-hardened armour that was used on the larger ships in the big roles, like the belt armour, in that particular case, British armour is qualitatively superior to American, what they called Class A armour. And that's simply due to metallurgical and metallurgical and chemical advances made during the interwar period that the Germans also independently made. As for how much, I've mentioned before in various videos, the figures vary wildly. Some people have you believe it's only 3 to 4% superior. Other sources would say it's 25% superior, which is a fair bit. Most sources tend to come down somewhere between 8 and 12 or 8 and 15%. So when I run the rough calculations in my head, I tend to use a factor of between 10 and 12% depending on the thickness of the armour, and that seems to be about right. So yes, face-hardened armour plate, World War II period, British armour is superior. When it comes to the other type of armour plate, this is the homogeneous steel plate. That's just a monolithic block of steel, doesn't have any particular face hardening qualities or anything. It's got the same material properties throughout, which in US terms is Class B armour. That is a different issue entirely. I would say, broadly speaking, you're not going to get much better for homogeneous armour plate than US Class B. And if you are, it's going to be marginal. So for that, take it or leave it. The British quality control for homogeneous armour plate wasn't as good as American, so you could probably make a decent argument to say that overall, if you're going to be building a class of ships, and if you are looking at that Class B or homogeneous armour plate, then yeah, sure, I'd quite happily say that you probably get better value out of using American armour. But if you're going to go with the face hardened stuff for the main protection for your battleships and such like, yeah, I'm going to go with the British by a significant margin. Kestrel Owens asks, can you explain the differences between what came before pre-dreadnoughts, dreadnoughts, super-dreadnoughts, etc.? I guess that means what the ships that were before pre-dreadnoughts. What specifically makes each of them different, or is there more vague differences? So this is fairly hard to quantify because, to be honest, although there are some broad definitions, almost every naval historian has their own slight tweaks and variations on how that works. So I'll give you my sort of take on the matter, and you can see what you think and compare it to other people's takes. So what came before pre-dreadnoughts? Well, you start off with things like Gloire and Warrior, which are broadside ironclads. They can have iron hulls, they can have wooden hulls with iron plate tacked onto them, but effectively they look like the last generation of Age of Sail frigates, except now made with having iron coatings and usually slightly heavier guns. This then moves on, at least in capital ship terms, to the central battery ironclad, which is where the armour starts to concentrate a bit more around the centre, and you usually have sponsons or casemates built out to allow the fewer guns now concentrated all near the middle on the hull to fire fore and aft. You then move on from there, although obviously there's a lot of overlap and back and forth, to turret ships. As I say, we're talking about capital ships only here, so we're ignoring things like monitors and such for the minute. But you've got the turret ships, things like Monarch or Captain. Then you start to see the masts going away, so you get mastless turret ships like the Devastation. Then from there you go on to variety of turret ships and barbette ships. So this goes through, there's quite a lot of variety in those. So you start off with something like Devastation, but that also includes ships with multiple single guns, which the French seem to like quite a lot. You've got ships like the Italia class, which basically have almost no armour, and the guns are put an echelon in the middle. You've got the armoured slippers of things like HMS Victoria and HMS Sans Pareil. And then you kind of start to see everything drifting back into an alignment with something like the Royal Sovereign class, which is basically the layout of a pre-dreadnought only with compound armour and barbette guns. You then get into the pre-dreadnoughts. So the pre-dreadnoughts are effectively characterised by fully armoured barbettes, which later come to be known as turrets, carrying 4 guns of roughly 12 to 13 inch caliber, but some variation did exist. Twin turret forward, twin turret aft, and then secondary, tertiary, and whatever else batteries you want down the side. approximate speed in the high teens, and also using steel armour, usually Harvey steel or some variation thereof, until Krupp steel is invented. The dreadnought's main difference from the pre-dreadnought is usually seen as dispensing with the main battle-ready secondary battery in exchange for a much larger main battery of heavy guns with centralised fire control, and secondary batteries, and in some cases tertiaries, are there purely to deal with destroyer attacks and torpedo boats and things like that. They're not there to engage really the enemy battleships themselves. Now, once you get into the dreadnought era, this is where things get very difficult, because you can disable dreadnought, super dreadnought, but then you run out of things to call them very quickly, and it's also a very, very broad categorization. Some people then go fast battleship, but whatever. So my classification would be first generation dreadnought, so that's things like dreadnought, South Carolina, Nassau, Helgoland, that kind of stuff. So those are all big gun ships, and they're pretty much what I said with the successors to the pre-dreadnoughts, usually with 12-inch guns. You then have, for me at least, second generation dreadnoughts. So this is where you start to see the dropping of echelon or wing turrets. So all turrets are on the centre line. They're still 11 or 12-inch gun ships, but they've generally all adopted, with the exception of one or two special cases, they've generally all adopted turbine propulsion at this point, and the secondary battery's gone up to between 4 and 6 inches, as opposed to some of the very early ones which had a very light secondary battery. So these would be things like Kaiser class, Florida, Wyoming class, HMS Neptune maybe, things such as that. So effectively, they're the next evolution of the 12-inch gun dreadnought design. You then have the super dreadnoughts. So the first super dreadnoughts, as defined, are things, well, actually, is defined by the arrival of HMS Orion. So this is where effectively the guns start to escalate. Whereas on the second gen dreadnoughts, one of the other things you might see cropping up is the triple turret. On the first generation super dreadnoughts, the characterization is bigger guns. So you've got 13.5 inch for the British, 14 inch for the Americans. The Germans are a little bit behind on that matter, so the less said the better. You've then got, to me at least, second generation super dreadnoughts. So second generation super dreadnought is going to be something like Queen Elizabeth or the US standards. So gun power can go up, or gun numbers can go up. So you either have 12, 14-inch guns, 8, 15-inch guns. So second generation super dreadnoughts quantitatively superior to a first generation super dreadnought. I mean, for all the fact it is a great ship, if you took something like, say, a Pennsylvania class up against USS Texas, it's not really much of a question that Pennsylvania wins. Likewise, Queen Elizabeth versus an Iron Duke or an Orion, and so on and so forth. Or let's say a Bayern versus a Kaiser. So that's sort of, for me at least, as a second generation super dreadnoughts. Then everything goes a bit skew post World War One, because you've got battlecruisers entering the mix, things like Hood, which arguably is potentially a fast battleship. Then you have the monsters, the N3s, the South Dakotas, the Tosas, etc., that are all being built post World War One, but they kind of all just die off. So you might as well call them Washington cherry trees, for lack of a better term, because they didn't really come about that much. Colorado's good example again of a second generation, or maybe a generation 2.5 super dreadnought. And then I think after that you get into slow and fast battleships. So you've got things like Nelson, possibly arguably Colorado, etc., which are the slow battleships, sub 25 knots. Nagato flip-flops either side of that categorization. And you have the fast battleships, so things like, again, arguably Hood, but then later on North Carolina, King George V, Richelieu, Bismarck, etc. They're all the fast battleships. And then you run out because they're all done. So yeah, that would be my idea anyway. Naomi Claire NL asks, checking out, that's my favourite non-British Age of Sail warship, the French Océan class, it seems that there are a few that spent quite a long time before being launched or commissioned. What's the story behind that, apart from the Napoleonic Wars not going well? Was it because there were ones built outside the main naval bases of Toulon and Brest, so things like skilled manpower are a problem? To a significant extent, the Napoleonic Wars would be a good summary of what actually caused the problems. It was a whole range of issues. Some of it was simply the fact that due to losses and, well, the revolution purging a lot of their competent officer corps at the beginning and various other things, the French Navy was running out of skilled crewmen to actually man these things, and the Océan class was a very, very large a series of very large ships. So when it came to do we actually have the manpower, priority tended to go to smaller ships first, which obviously if you're not going to crew this ship in the foreseeable future, there's not much point in spending money finishing it. With the British blockade, there were supply shortages of certain critical items, not even necessarily because they couldn't get them, but more because they couldn't transport them. Because yes, you can transport cannon overland in the early 1800s, and yes, you can transport masts and spars and things like that overland in the early 1800s. It's just incredibly difficult and incredibly slow. It's much easier to stick them all on a small coastal trading vessel and send them along the coast by sea. Unfortunately, when you have 600 odd Royal Navy warships floating around looking menacingly at anything that so much as dares venture out of port, this becomes something more of a problem. And so, yeah, supplies and logistics dry up, especially for the really big stuff, because although no warship's mast is a particularly small affair, the size and bulk of a first-rate's masts and rigging is significantly greater than that of a frigate's. So, again, that slows them down as well. And finally, was also, to be fair, a certain lack of interest. After Trafalgar, Napoleon had, well, more Russian-shaped things to worry about, especially when it came to the winter, and the whole focus of the French campaigns shifted much more to land-based, and so obviously funding and other sources of resource to allow them to continue building began to dry up as well, because there was basically no real appetite for the French trying to build another navy to refight Trafalgar. Apart from anything else, it didn't help you have people like Admiral Cochrane who would just run in occasionally and burn or capture French ships just as they'd finished them or just before they'd finished them, which really didn't help the whole apathy towards the situation from the French side of things. Brandon Conover asks, what do you think of the Japanese cruiser Tsukuba? Well, that's a bit of an interesting one, isn't it? Well, here it is, the supposedly, well, inaccurately titled protected cruiser Tsukuba. It's actually an armoured cruiser. And in some ways you could even say it was a battle cruiser before battle cruisers were a thing. For those of you who are not aware, this was a pre-dreadnought era ship. It was designed as an armoured cruiser, so yeah, the postcard is wrong there. It had belt armour. But it, although it was classified as an armoured cruiser, it had basically a pre-dreadnought's main armament. I mean, let's just read off the main armament. So, 4 12-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, 1 fore, 1 aft, secondary battery of 12 6-inch guns in casemates, tertiary battery of 12 120mm or 4.7-inch guns, and a handful of 3-pounders and 3 torpedo tubes. Now, does that sound like anything to you? Yeah, it sounds pretty much like the armament of a pre-dreadnought. And that's pretty much because that's what it is. Except that at the time period that it was laid down and launched, which was 1905, laid down to launch at the end of 1905, commission in 1907, it was faster than any pre-dreadnought battleship, being capable of between 20 and 21 knots, in exchange for which it had reduced belt armor, maximum belt thickness of 7.1 inches, although ironically enough, this did make it still more heavily protected than the Invincible class battlecruisers, which were about to begin construction. So by all rights, it's effectively a pre-dreadnought battlecruiser. It's somewhat less well protected, slightly faster, similar kind of main armament. It just happened to suffer the unfortunate fact that, well, as we just said, it was laid down in 1905. So the next year out came Dreadnought, and then a couple of years down the line out came the Invincibles, and the poor old thing was basically done for. It was reclassified as a battle cruiser around 1912 in acknowledgement of its capabilities, but ultimately at 20 to 21 knots, using vertical triple expansion engines, it was never going to be seen as a true battle cruiser in the sense of the Invincibles, Von der Tann, and their respective successors. So yeah, as a concept, I quite like it. It certainly shows a school of thought that was fractionally ahead of the curve, much like actually the Satsumas were, to be honest, compared to a lot of other naval schools of thinking. It's just in some ways a bit like the Blücher, actually, the World War I Blücher, that is. It went down slightly the wrong line due to being slightly too early. So in Blücher's case, they got the speed right, they got the armour right, they got the guns wrong. In this case, they got the armour right. Well, they got it better than Invincible anyway. They got the guns right for the armament they knew of for capital ships at the time, but they got the speed wrong because, well, they didn't have turbines and such. So yeah, it's a very good ship. Would have probably been the start of a trend had the Dreadnought not come along, and just suffered from the slight unfortunate nature of being left behind by history. Zombie Hero 14 asks, during the shelling of the Normandy coast on D-Day, Royal Navy ships fired their turrets in sequence, whilst the US Navy fired them all at once. Was this just a preference, or was there a reason for the difference? Preference did come into it to a certain degree. I mean, there were some US ships, not necessarily capital ships, but there were some US ships that would fire sequential salvos, and there were some British ships that were just unloading with everything all at once. But in terms of precise reasoning why, I suspect a great deal of it would probably just come down to the doctrine of shore bombardment by both sides. Because, well, both parts of the same side, I should say. Because ultimately, your target is a ground target, it's not going anywhere, which makes things awfully easier for fire control systems and calculating time of flight of shells, etc. But as a result, the British tended to follow the system, since they had the luxury of not really being shot back by anything that was a serious danger to them, of being in contact with people ashore who could correct the fall of shot, or with aircraft and such like. So it'd be sort of a case of, okay, right, well, we're firing on this target, let's fire turret 1. Let's say if you're Rodney, fire turret 1, report, did it, okay, was it long, short, left, right, okay, correct, fire turret 2. In theory, this could allow you to zero in on your targets a lot faster and minimize your expenditure of shells. Whereas on some US capital ships, it was more a case of, well, we know approximately where the enemy is, okay, load everything up, and bear in mind that most fortifications such are not designed to stand up to heavy battleship caliber naval shells. It was just a case of, well, I imagine the captain of a US warship going out onto the wing of his bridge, staring at the Normandy coast, bringing up a scroll, and then just going, "Dear grid coordinates, I no longer wish you to exist. Signed, the US Navy. Open fire." And that will be pretty much the end of that, because, well, hey, if you blow up everything at the grid coordinates, you don't necessarily need to correct for shot or fire again. Each method has a quality all of its own. And now we go on to the Discord questions. So apart from last week's question, which has almost inspired me to make a video of like what happens if the Great Eastern survives through to 1950 or something like that, let's look at this. Fort Master says, so I went on the internet and I found this. The battleship of the future. Barring the stupid design decision of putting smokestacks at the waterline, what do you think could be done to make this a feasible battleship of the future? So, what would I do to improve this? Oi, oi, oi. I think that this article must have been written by, or the drawing at least, must have been prepared by somebody who had heard of battleships but had never actually seen one or contemplated one. And probably had also seen something like a Coronation class steam locomotive run past and go, "Ooh, streamlining, that'll do." Right, so the numerous problems with this. Well, for one thing, I don't know if you can see in the resolution of the picture, but those turrets won't actually turn. The arc on the back is far too little, and they're flush with the superstructure. So, congratulations, you have constructed a battleship whose, I guess, Q turret's only function is to blow away the rear superstructure when inevitably it rebels and declares its independence from the rest of the ship. Other than that, oh my goodness, if the King George V didn't have enough issues with having a quad and a twin, this ship has a quad, then a triple, then a twin, then either a twin or a triple, it's not entirely clear, and then a quad again. You may want to rationalise that down. So yes, if you're going to go with 6 turrets, I mean, I guess 6 turrets designs have been done, although quite why you don't just go with 2 3 turret stacks and instead have some weird Q turret amidships between the superstructure. But anyway, whatever. Just do it all in triples. You'll get the same number of guns roughly, and it'll make logistics so much easier. The superstructure, I mean, there's not a tremendous amount wrong with that. Maybe a fraction short for good fire control, but it is what it is. I'd try and merge it all into one, to be honest, because it'd be better just to have an Atlanta-style triple turret stack fore and aft instead of that weird Q-ship's position. I don't understand that. Secondary batteries, well, actually, they might not be suffering from the same can't actually turn problem as the main batteries. The secondary batteries are actually not terrible, ironically enough. But as for the midship section and the side protection, yeah, that's just no. I mean, look at the bit on the left. The selling point of this thing with its trunked exhaust fence is if a torpedo hits, it'll be deflected upwards or downwards. You don't want to deflect a torpedo downwards into the lower portion of your ship. This is a stupid idea. I mean, upwards, okay, fair enough. Upwards into the main armour belt, that probably will do less damage. But downwards, really? This is a selling point? I mean, not to mention the fact that if the torpedo just has a contact detonating warhead and it blows up right next to your exhaust vent, it's going to mean, well, loss of updraft in your engines at best. At worst, it's going to lead to copious amounts of water flooding your engines instantly and rendering you mostly powerless. Yeah, just no. Also, look at the top right. Look at how much space that trunking is taking up. Just run the flipping funnel up through the rear of the enlarged superstructure and have it done normally. Those would be my major issues and dash complaints with this particular design. The less said about that little one down on the centre left, the alternate version, the better. But yeah, those are my main. Those would be my main complaints. Otherwise, are the aesthetics. Otherwise, relatively nice. Soup asks, what was the reasoning by the Japanese as to why they built lighter cruisers to lead destroyer flotillas? I mean, this was actually an extension of a concept that a couple of navies in the First World War had tried out, including the British, who also specifically built light cruisers for this purpose. And the whole thing drew out of the flotilla leader concept. So obviously the flotilla leader, as discussed in the couple of videos we've done about destroyer development, was kind of a bigger, slightly nastier destroyer flagship for the flotilla commander or commodore to lead the entire flotilla from. And they needed to be bigger because they needed the extra space for the command staff, and while they were big, you might as well stick an extra gun or torpedo or whatever in as well. Back in the First World War, the British built a series of light cruisers where they just went, well, you know what, why not just go even bigger? Because the one problem with the flotilla leaders' destroyers was they were just about visually distinct enough that they could be picked out and targeted, But whilst they were slightly bigger and meaner than the average destroyer, they weren't big enough and mean enough to hold off 2 or 3 destroyers that might come after them in a coordinated attack to try and decapitate the command structure. Whereas a light cruiser that could keep up with the destroyers and obviously possessed quite a few more guns and in slightly larger calibers, that could hold off a significant portion of the of a destroyer attack. So it boosted the firepower and also gave an even better platform for command and control, as well as being more survivable. So this concept kind of continued onwards into the post-World War I period with things like the Belgrano class for the Japanese, and to a certain extent even the Omaha class for the United States Navy. So yeah, basically the idea was the flotilla leader can then be in a large ship that's got plenty of space for him to organise and command from. It's got a higher vantage point, it's got the firepower to deal with any potential enemy destroyers it might run into. Again, obviously assuming in that wonderful way that a lot of navies seem to do, that no one else will build a counter to them, but never mind. And overall it would just be a better command than a slightly enlarged destroyer. So that's pretty much their reasoning. Life Beyond Living asks, if modernised similarly to other existing World War I era capital ships, would the British 12-inch and 13.5-inch armoured battlecruisers be a valuable asset for minor combatants in World War II, such as the Commonwealth nations? For the 12-inch gun battlecruisers, no. The Invincibles were out of date. You can argue exactly when they were out of date by, but by the end of World War I they were very definitely out of date. Their armour wasn't adequate by that point. To be honest, their guns weren't particularly brilliant either. Much better 12-inch guns had come in. Their turret layout wasn't good. Their speed definitely wasn't fantastic. Yeah, no, just no. They needed to go. I mean, there's a reason the Chileans didn't accept them. 13.5-inch ones, however, potential. I mean, their top speed isn't too far away from what the Congos were when they were built. So if they're completely modernised, you could potentially do something very similar to the Congos. One-for-one replacement of old machinery with new, switch over to oil firing. That'll push their speed up to something where they can keep up quite comfortably with most light and heavy cruisers. 13.5-inch guns are still not pushover. Armour, if you're talking about something like Tiger or Princess Royal, armour is actually, with a few tweaks here and there, is actually better than what the Congos would have had. So that's your speed, fire, power and protection triangle. So if you've got all of that in place, yeah, you're not going to be fighting any major enemy capital ships with them, but for Commonwealth nations that have to worry about enemy cruisers or running escorts, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., very possibly would have been useful and valuable assets. I mean, a refitted HMAS Tiger operating at the Battle of the Sunda Strait would have changed things quite dramatically. Obviously, you would need to modernise and bulge them to give them a little bit of torpedo protection. And I'd wager, yeah, maybe not Lion, but Princess Royal and or Tiger fully modernised would definitely be able to stand up to a Congo. So maybe if you had HMNZS Princess Royal and HMAS Tiger sailing around as a pair at the beginning of the Pacific War, that would have given the Japanese quite a few conniption fits, because those two are going to lay waste to any Japanese heavy cruiser that rolls around. And given that 2 Congos seem to be the default deployment for a lot of early operations in that area by the Japanese, 2 Congos I would not put money on in that engagement, particularly. So, yeah, they could have been very valuable. The only, obviously, downside to that is that it would almost certainly lead to everybody building counters or responses or protesting or whatever. So that is very much a scenario in isolation and not what you can necessarily classify as what would probably be a true scenario. Turret Welder asks, if you had to serve as a crew member on an Axis ship, which theatre would you be fighting in? That's an easy one. I would be in the Mediterranean fighting in the Italian Navy, because the worst thing you have to worry about in the Italian Navy is incompetent senior officers. Well, also try and keep a better lookout at night if you're on a heavy cruiser. But anyway, yeah. If I go and serve in the Japanese Navy, well, one, I'm going to have the ever-living daylights beaten out of me every so often by whichever officer decides I haven't shined my shoes exactly right. If I'm really unlucky, I might be assigned to a 25mm gun crew, and there's every possibility I might be asked to go and die gloriously for the Emperor as a chiton driver or some other equally idiotic thing. And if I manage to dodge all of that, well, then I might as well start throwing rocks at the ungodly numbers of aircraft the USN is going to throw at me later in the war, which doesn't sound like a very fun idea to me at all. If I'm going to be in the Kriegsmarine, well, much of the Kriegsmarine was probably, in my estimation at least, the least Nazified of the three German branches of the military. I'm still fighting for the Germans, which I have something of a problem with, considering the background of some of my family's closest friends. But anyway, the less said about that, the better. If I was going to end up in the Kriegsmarine, there is, well, one, U-boats. No, I do not want to serve on a U-boat. There are many ways to die, but being crushed to death under the Atlantic by a depth charge is not the one I want to go by. Not by a long shot. I also don't want to drown in the freezing Arctic waters of Norway. I really, really don't want to wake up one morning to find Warspite coming around the corner in the middle of a fjord and sitting around waiting for the RAF to blitz me out of existence is not fun either. So, kind of by default, you end up in the Italians, and it's like, well, okay, so decent food, don't really have to worry about massive amounts of carpet bombing, not likely to be sent on suicide missions, not working with quite the worst, not working for quite the worst genocidal maniac, and yeah, individually, as long as I don't end up on one of the one of the condottieri type cruisers, but individually, I've got a relatively decent chance of surviving things. And hey, Mediterranean weather, what else can you ask for? So yes, Italians, most probably the best posting to go for a time-travelling British person who's forced to be in the Axis Navy. Plus, obviously, Italy ducks out of the war early, which is great. So I get to say I participated in the war and only put my life at risk for half the time. It's a good deal all round, I'd say. Turret Welder says, if you had to design any kind of ship for combat in World War II, what kind of ship would it be? Destroyer, cruiser, carrier, etc. And what would it be like? Well, aside from my ultimate battleship concept, as seen here, so kindly put together by Discord user Moristopheles, which remains to me the ideal pinnacle of a massive, ridiculous battleship design, if I'm forced to be slightly more realistic and design a ship for a nation for combat and have it be a single class, what would it be like and what would it be? Well, I think we're probably looking at, depending on how sadistic I want to be, I would either try and design an actual half-decent cruiser for the Kriegsmarine, i.e. something that's not so unseaworthy they dare not send it out into the Atlantic, or else so hilariously overbuilt that it weighs almost as much as a Baltimore and has about the same firepower as a 1930s era actual treaty compliant cruiser. This one actually took a lot of thinking about, to be honest, but because basically what it comes down to is, well, if I'm designing for the Americans, can I do better than the Fletcher? Probably not. Can I do better than the Essex? Probably not. Well, I could give it an armoured deck. I could make an armoured deck Essex, but that would end up with all sorts of shenanigans. Can I do better than the Baltimores? Again, probably not. And, well, you've got the Iowas, it's like, well, they don't need to do much better than the Iowas, well, because where was the Japanese battleship force by the time they came into service? With the British, like, there's a few bits and pieces I could look at doing, but at the same time, there's not going to be the money to build them. I already mentioned the Germans. Um, the Italians had good ships, but through various shenanigans managed to not use them properly. There's nothing really I can do to help the Japanese. They picked a fight with America in America's own personal pond, so I guess I could make a white flag machine for them. Might save a few lives. No, so I've decided if I could design any one ship that would be ready for combat in World War II, and may just about be realistically built bought affordable by its owners, I would build a sort of top of the line heavy cruiser for the Greek Navy, because I feel the Greeks get a little bit hard done by. The Free French, the Polish, Norwegian, etc. navies that skedaddled over to the UK after their various countries fell, they either brought with them good ships that they could keep fighting with, like the Bliskevice, or they were given modern ships like the Stord during the fight with the Scharnhorst, the Battle of North Cape. Poor old Greeks, they kind of had to do with what they had mostly. Obviously, some of it got lost fairly quickly, and poor old Georgios Averof, although it was very good back in the day, eventually got relegated to convoy duty, so they didn't really get the same opportunities to have a go at their oppressors the same way that the Norwegians and the Polish and the Free French did. So given that it's Greek Navy, they're probably only going to be able to afford one, but like the Averof at the time, they're going to have to therefore go for quality. Assuming that they've got a few drachma to put together, I would probably design something along the lines of a heavy cruiser, but since I'm not signatory to the naval treaties, I would go for 4 triple 8-inch turrets. I could probably buy them off the Americans. I'm sure they'd be happy to do that. My displacement's probably going to be in the 15 to 18,000 ton range. And given that it's Greece, so obviously they're throwing this together from all sorts of different navies. Let's see. So let's have the British build the hull. We'll have the Americans supply the main guns. I'm not taking German machinery, no. No. I'll have Italian machinery. I'll stick twin 4.5-inch AA guns from the UK in as my heavy AA. Some 20mm Oerlikons, which I'll probably snaffle off the Americans for my secondary AA, and I'd probably be looking at either 6 to 8 of these 4.5-inch turrets, probably a couple of dozen 20mm. I'm going to have to go with a seaplane launcher because, hey, this is a run up to World War II. The aerial scouting part is necessary, and who knows, obviously using hindsight, by the time the war breaks out, that'll leave me some displacement to lose in order to get radar. And yeah, with the machinery in place, Italian machinery in place, obviously it can be short range because it's a Mediterranean fighter, so ramp it up to maybe 33 to 35 knots and stick a couple of quad torpedo tubes on each side. This gives me and armour-wise, give it, I'd probably give it a 6 or 7-inch thick belt to be able to, and sort of 3-inch deck to be able to fight off other heavy cruisers. So with my single, almost cruiser killer flagship, I would then obviously that'd be for the Greek Navy, and then when Greece gets invaded, it, along with the Averof and the various destroyers, all will go skedaddling down to Alexandria, where that ship will probably prove to be a very valuable asset in the Mediterranean fleet. So Averof can go and enjoy semi-retirement escorting convoys, and I can charge around shooting Italians and the odd German throughout the war, and I think that'll be very fun. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again in another video some point soon in the future.